Welcome to the Life in Stories channel. From which part of the world are you watching us? Let's get started with a story from the Reddit. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, every sign was there, glaring like neon lights in the darkness, the sudden, late nights, the hushed phone calls, her guarded demeanor whenever I entered a room. But when you love someone, when you trust them, it's so easy to lie to yourself. It's easier to believe that the woman you vowed to spend your life with wasn't capable of betraying you, let alone conspiring to take that life. But this isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of what happens when love rots, when trust turns to venom. My wife, Allison, and her best friend, Brandon, they thought they could have it all. They thought they could cheat on me, take my life, and walk away hand in hand with their perfect little plan. What they didn't count on was me. Or what I would become. It started subtly. The cracks, I mean. I had always thought Allison's relationship with Brandon was odd, but she always had excuses. He's like a brother to me, she'd say, rolling her eyes. You're being paranoid. And the thing about paranoia is it feeds on isolation. She made me feel crazy for even asking questions, so I stopped. I buried my doubts and let them fester. Then, one night, it all shattered. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the silence thick between us. Allison stared at her phone, pretending I wasn't there, her thumb scrolling endlessly. I should have walked away. I should have let it go. Instead, I asked, "Who are you texting?" Her head snapped up, her eyes cold. "No one." "Why are you always up my ass about my phone?" "Because you never put it down," I shot back, my tone sharper than I intended. I didn't care. I was done pretending. She stared at me for a long moment, a look I couldn't quite place settling across her face. Disdain, maybe. Or something worse. Something darker. Then she smiled. "If you're so worried, why don't you check it?" She tossed the phone into my lap. My hands froze. It was a trap, one I didn't know how to navigate. I hadn't been expecting her to give it up so easily. But when my hesitation stretched too long, she snatched it back and laughed, a cruel, humorless sound. "See? You don't even want to know. You just want to fight." But I did want to know. Desperately. I couldn't get that laugh out of my head. That's the moment I knew something was very wrong. And whatever it was, Allison wasn't just hiding it, she was daring me to find out. The truth came 2 nights later. The truth always has a way of crawling into the light, no matter how tightly you try to bury it. For me, the night of discovery started like any other. Allison had gone to visit her sister, an excuse that was growing moldy from overuse, and I sat in the house we'd built together, alone, swirling a glass of whiskey while replaying every excuse she'd fed me for months. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I could feel the walls closing in. Around midnight, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I wondered if it was Allison, maybe she'd forgotten her key. But when I opened the door, I found a man standing there. He looked worn, gaunt even, like someone who'd just crawled out of a storm. In his hand was a file folder. "You're Mark, right?" His voice was raw, low. I nodded slowly, gripping the doorframe. "Who the hell are you?" He looked over his shoulder, nervously, before answering. "Call me Carter. You don't know me, but I know your wife." He hesitated, his words measured. "And Brandon." At the sound of that name, something inside me snapped taut. A mix of dread and rage burned through me, but I kept my voice even. "What about them?" Carter extended the file toward me. "They've been careful, but not careful enough. You should see this." I didn't take the folder right away. I studied him, the dark circles under his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand. Whoever he was, he was either telling the truth or playing the most elaborate trick I'd ever seen. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Why not go to them?" "They tried to ruin me," he said, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "And I don't want them to get away with it again." I grabbed the file and shut the door without another word. My hands shook as I opened it, as if I already knew that whatever was inside would rip my life in two. And I was right. The first few photos were grainy, but there was no mistaking the figures in them. Allison and Brandon, kissing in his car, sneaking into hotel rooms, their hands on each other like teenagers in heat. My stomach turned. I couldn't breathe, but I forced myself to flip through every single one, searing each image into my brain. It wasn't just the photos. There were copies of emails, text messages, all meticulous, damning evidence of their affair. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. It was the second envelope tucked inside, marked with the word insurance. Inside were details, notes, plans, and something that made the room spin. A life insurance policy. One in my name. Allison had taken it out months ago. $1 million payout. That's when I realized, the affair was just the beginning. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted me dead. The folder lay open on the table like a snake coiled to strike. The photos, the texts, the life insurance policy, it all blurred together as my mind raced to catch up. My wife, the woman I had loved for years, and Brandon, the man I had been stupid enough to tolerate, were plotting something far worse than betrayal. They were plotting my death. I sat in the quiet darkness of our living room, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My pulse thudded in my ears, but a strange calm washed over me, as if my body knew that panic wouldn't save me. I poured another glass of whiskey, my hand steady this time. I needed to think. The insurance policy had been taken out 3 months ago. Allison had forged my signature, she knew my handwriting well enough for it to pass inspection. $1 million payout. That wasn't pocket change. That was enough to start a brand new life. And with the affair in full swing, I could see how they thought it would all fall into place. Mark dies tragically in an accident. Allison grieves convincingly. Brandon comforts her, and they walk away with enough money to live happily ever after. The bastards. But Carter. Carter had thrown a wrench into their perfect little plan. Why? Who was he really? And why would he come to me instead of going to the cops? I picked up the folder again, flipping to the final page. At the bottom of one of the notes, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a name, Carter Wills, followed by an address. No phone number. No explanation. Just a breadcrumb left in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table until dawn, my thoughts churning in endless circles. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to run to the police or confront Allison like a fool. No, I was going to play the game they thought they'd already won. And I was going to make them destroy each other. The address Carter had left me was across town, a rundown apartment complex that looked like it had seen better days, better decades, really. I parked across the street and waited. The windows were dark, the building lifeless. For a moment, I thought the whole thing had been some cruel joke, but then I saw him. Carter emerged from the front door, clutching a bag of takeout. He looked worse than he had the night before, hollow, jittery, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I watched as he walked to an old sedan, his gaze flicking over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to grab him at any moment. I stepped out of my car and crossed the street. Carter. He froze mid-step, the takeout bag swinging in his grip. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw something in his eyes, fear, or maybe relief. Mark. Why did you come to me? I asked. Why not go to the police? Carter sighed, glancing around before speaking. Because the police can't help you. Trust me, I tried. Tried? I frowned. Try to do what? He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking down to the cracked pavement. Brandon and Allison, this isn't their first time. I think they've done this before. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What are you talking about? Brandon, he's a predator, Carter said, his voice trembling. He latches onto married women, convinces them to play his little games. He uses them, then they use their husbands. Life insurance scams, accidents, payouts, until one of them screws up and it all falls apart. My blood ran cold. You're telling me there are others? Carter nodded slowly. I was married once. Her name was Emily. Brandon was her friend, too. It started the same way, late nights, excuses, lies. Then she started talking about life insurance policies. I confronted her, and she swore it was nothing, but the day before my car brakes failed, I found out the truth. I left before they could finish what they started. And Emily? I asked. Carter's face fell. She stayed with him. I haven't seen her in years. I stared at him, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, had fallen into the orbit of a man like Brandon, a man who didn't just seduce and manipulate. He destroyed. Why didn't you stop him? I demanded. Carter flinched. I tried. I reported him. I showed the cops everything. But you know how it goes, no hard proof, no arrests. The system doesn't care until you're dead. I clenched my fists, my teeth grinding together. Well, that's not going to happen. Not this time. Carter looked at me, a flicker of something in his eyes. Then you're smarter than I was. What are you going to do? I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I'm going to make them regret ever thinking they could win. Carter was right, the system wouldn't help me. Even if I took everything in that folder to the police, Allison and Brandon would wriggle their way out of it. Life insurance policies weren't illegal. Adultery wasn't a crime. And a few grainy photos didn't amount to attempted murder. No, they'd deny everything, make me look paranoid, and keep planning my demise. But I wasn't going to let that happen. When I left Carter's apartment, the plan began forming in my mind, half instinct, half madness. Allison and Brandon thought I was blind to their little scheme, that I'd walk right into the trap they'd set. I decided I'd play along, just enough to make them comfortable. And when the moment was right, I'd turn the trap back on them. But first, I needed to test Carter's theory. I needed proof that Brandon had done this before. The next day, I went back to work as though nothing had changed. I sat at my desk, answered emails, forced polite smiles at coworkers, all while the evidence from the folder burned a hole in my briefcase. When the clock hit 5, I didn't go home. Instead, I parked outside Brandon's gym, his office, as Allison liked to call it. I watched as women came and went, each one greeted by that perfect, charming smile he wore like a mask. To anyone else, Brandon looked like a clean-cut, harmless guy. A successful personal trainer. A good friend. But to me, every glance, every laugh was laced with something more sinister. Then, I saw her. A blonde woman, maybe mid-30s, walking toward the gym entrance. Brandon's face lit up the moment he saw her, his hand brushing against her arm as he led her inside. It was subtle, practiced, but I'd seen it before, on Allison. I didn't need to follow them inside to know what was happening. Brandon wasn't just seducing women. He was hunting them. Back at home, I found Allison sitting at the dining table, flipping through some paperwork. She looked up as I walked in, her expression instantly shifting to that well-worn mask of indifference. "You're home late," she said, her tone flat. I shrugged, dropping my bag by the door. "Busy day at work." "What's that?" She tensed for half a second, a flicker of nervousness that might have gone unnoticed if I weren't watching so closely. "Oh, just bills. Sorting things out." She was lying. I approached her slowly, resting my hand on the back of her chair. "You've been doing a lot of sorting lately." "Yeah, well, someone has to," she replied with a forced laugh. "You don't pay attention to this stuff." I leaned down slightly, close enough that I knew my presence made her uncomfortable. "I trust you to handle it." She stiffened. That was the cruel irony of our marriage. I did trust her. And she was using that trust as a weapon. That night, after she fell asleep, I went looking for answers. Allison had always been meticulous about her secrets, passwords, hidden folders, phone locks, but no one hides everything. I started with her desk drawers and then moved to the file cabinet, searching for anything that connected her to Brandon's scheme. And then I found it. Tucked in a manila folder beneath tax documents was a crumpled piece of paper, a receipt for a hotel room booked under an alias. The date matched one of the nights she'd visited her sister. Scrawled on the back were 3 words in Brandon's handwriting. "Trust the plan." The words sent a chill through me. They weren't just reckless lovers sneaking around. This was calculated. Practiced. That's when I knew Carter wasn't the only one they'd targeted before. And I wouldn't be the last. The next morning, I woke up early and made Allison breakfast, pancakes, her favorite. She looked at me suspiciously as I placed the plate in front of her. "What's this for?" she asked, her fork hovering mid-air. I smiled warmly, as if nothing had changed. "Just felt like doing something nice." Her gaze lingered on mine, searching for cracks. But I didn't flinch. "Are you feeling okay?" she finally asked. "Never better." As she ate, I casually mentioned something I knew would get her attention. "Oh, I ran into Brandon yesterday." She froze, her fork clinking against the plate. "At the gym?" I nodded. "Yeah, he mentioned you two have been catching up a lot lately. Said you've been helping him with some plans." Her face paled. "What's that supposed to mean?" I chuckled softly, playing dumb. "Nothing. Just funny how you've been spending so much time with him lately. Must be nice having such a close friend." For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her fork down, her mind racing to figure out if I knew more than I was letting on. I stood up, grabbing my keys. "I'll see you tonight, okay?" As I left, I glanced back at her. She sat motionless, staring at the plate of half-eaten pancakes, her mask slipping just enough for me to see the panic beneath. Good. Let her wonder. Let her sweat. This was just the beginning. The trick to revenge is patience. Allison and Brandon had spent months, or maybe longer, crafting their little scheme. I couldn't bring it down overnight. No, I had to move carefully, piece by piece, until I turned them against each other. The first step was planting the seeds of doubt. 2 days after the pancakes incident, I stopped by Brandon's gym unannounced. I wore my best mask, a mix of oblivious husband and friendly acquaintance. Brandon was behind the front desk when I walked in. His smile flickered the moment he saw me, like a poker player dealt a bad hand. "Mark. What brings you here?" "I thought I'd finally take you up on that free training session," I said, grinning like an idiot. "Allison always talks about how great you are. Figured I could use the help." Brandon's expression tightened, but his charm was quick to return. "Of course. I'd be happy to help." He led me into the gym, and for the next hour, I let him play his part. The perfect trainer. The perfect friend. He corrected my form, cracked jokes, and acted like he didn't want to bash my skull in with a kettlebell. I waited until we were alone in the locker room to make my move. "Brandon," I said, wiping sweat from my face, "I wanted to ask you something." He paused mid-motion, a towel draped over his shoulder. Yeah. I hesitated just long enough to make him uncomfortable. It's Allison. She's been distant lately. I thought maybe you'd noticed. You two have been close, right? Brandon's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. We're friends, Mark. That's it. Of course, I said quickly, waving it off. I just figured, if something was bothering her, maybe she'd talk to you. He studied me carefully, trying to gauge how much I knew. I let my mask hold. After a moment, he forced a smile. She hasn't said anything to me. I'm sure everything's fine. Yeah. You're probably right. I clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture deliberate. Thanks, Brandon. I appreciate it. I left the gym without another word, but I knew I'd planted the first seed. He would go back to Allison and ask questions. He'd probe, trying to figure out if she'd let something slip. And when Allison realized I'd been at the gym, asking about her, she'd start to question Brandon's loyalty. Doubt is a powerful thing. That evening, I came home late. Allison was sitting in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her expression guarded. You were at the gym today, she said. I set my keys on the table, feigning surprise. Oh, Brandon called you, huh? She didn't answer. Her eyes narrowed, searching for something in my face. What were you doing there? Working out, I said casually. I thought you'd be happy. You're always saying I should take better care of myself. You've never been interested in the gym before. I smiled, leaning against the doorframe. Things change, Allison. Her gaze lingered on mine for a moment longer before she looked away. Brandon said you were asking about me. I shrugged. So? You have been distant lately. I figured you were just stressed, but, I trailed off, watching her carefully. But what? She snapped. I let the silence hang between us, long enough to make her uneasy. Then I smiled again, soft and forgiving. Nothing. Forget I said anything. She didn't say another word, but as I turned and walked to the kitchen, I could feel her eyes on me. She was trying to figure out if I was playing dumb, or if I really was dumb. Let her wonder. The next day, I returned to Carter's apartment. He opened the door looking like he hadn't slept in weeks, but he let me in without question. You were right, I said, pacing the tiny living room. Brandon's already getting nervous. I can see it. Carter sank into the couch, running a hand through his hair. That's good. But you need to be careful. Brandon's dangerous when he feels cornered. I know. I stopped pacing, turning to face him. But I need more. You said there were others. Other husbands. Other accidents. Do you have proof? Carter hesitated, his expression pained. Not much. I tried to collect evidence after Emily, but, he trailed off, staring at the floor. Brandon covers his tracks well. Anything, I pressed. Emails. Names. Anything that connects him to other accidents. After a long pause, Carter got up and disappeared into the bedroom. When he returned, he was holding a small, battered notebook. This is all I have. Names, dates, places where it happened. I couldn't prove any of it, but maybe you can. I took the notebook from him, flipping through the pages. Dozens of names were scrawled inside, each one a silent testament to a life Brandon had destroyed. At the bottom of one page was a name I didn't recognize, Daniel Price. Who's this? I asked, pointing to the name. Carter's face darkened. He's the only one who survived. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my car outside the house, staring at the faint glow of our bedroom window. Allison was up there, probably texting Brandon, whispering plans they thought I didn't know about. But the game had already begun. They didn't realize it yet, but I was holding the strings now. And when the time came, I'd make sure they pulled themselves apart. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Let the unraveling begin. The following days passed with a quiet tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Allison tried to act normal, smiling politely, cooking dinner, even asking about my day like we weren't sitting on the edge of a knife. I played along, every smile a mask, every "I love you" a lie sharper than any blade. But beneath her calm exterior, I could see it, doubt. It was in the way she'd glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her fingers tightening around her phone when it buzzed. Brandon was cracking, and she knew it. I spent the next morning digging through Carter's notebook, piecing together the names and timelines. Most of it was scraps, half a story here, a rumor there, but one name kept jumping out at me: Daniel Price. The only survivor. If anyone could help me, it was him. It took some digging, but I tracked Daniel down to a small construction company 2 towns over. I made the drive that afternoon, turning over what I would say in my mind as I stared at the road ahead. How do you tell a man that you're being hunted by the same predator who almost killed him? Daniel turned out to be a man in his mid-40s, weathered by life but strong, like a man who'd seen hell and clawed his way back. When I found him outside his worksite, sitting on the edge of a flatbed truck, he eyed me with suspicion. "You lost or something?" he asked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I need to talk to you about Brandon." His expression froze, his entire demeanor shifting. He stared at me for a long time before speaking. "Who are you?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "My name's Mark. My wife, Allison. She's involved with him." Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on his knees. "Get out of here." "Wait, please," I said quickly. "You're the only one who knows. I need your help." He stood, towering over me, his voice a low growl. "What the hell do you think you're going to do? You think you can stop him? Brandon doesn't lose. You hear me? You'll end up buried just like the rest of them. So why aren't you?" I shot back. "Why did you survive?" Daniel stopped, his breathing ragged. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me, but instead, he looked away, staring off at the horizon like he was seeing something long buried. "Because I got lucky," he muttered. "And because I wasn't afraid to fight back." I swallowed hard. "Tell me how. Please." He turned to me again, his eyes narrowing. "I'll tell you what I told the cops, what I told Carter, what I'll tell anyone who listens. Brandon's a snake, but snakes slip up when they get greedy. That's when you strike." Daniel jabbed a finger at me. "But you better be ready, because if you miss, he'll make sure you don't get another shot." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Allison slept beside me. Daniel's words echoed in my mind. Snakes slip up when they get greedy. The question was, how do you make someone like Brandon greedy enough to expose himself? Then it hit me. Allison was the key. The next morning, I set the first real trap. At breakfast, I played the part of the distracted husband perfectly. I sipped my coffee, scrolling through my phone as if I didn't have a care in the world. Allison sat across from me, quiet, pushing her eggs around her plate. "Hey," I said casually, not looking up. "Did you ever get around to calling the insurance company? About that policy?" Her fork clattered against the plate. "What?" "The life insurance," I said, glancing up just long enough to see the color drain from her face. "I remember you mentioned you wanted to double-check something about it. You said it might need updating." She stared at me, frozen. Why are you asking about that?" I shrugged, playing dumb. "I don't know. Just popped into my head. Is everything good with it?" Her mask slipped for just a second, just long enough for me to see the fear behind her eyes. "Yeah. Everything's fine," she said quickly. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Just asking," I said with a smile. She got up from the table abruptly, grabbing her phone as she left the room. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before I pulled out my own phone. It was time to push Brandon. I sent him a message from a burner number I'd picked up 2 days earlier. A simple, anonymous text. "How long until she turns on you?" I pictured him reading it, his smug face contorting as doubt sank its teeth into him. He'd know Allison hadn't sent it. He'd know it wasn't me, because as far as he was concerned, I was still oblivious. Which meant someone else was watching him. I sent the second message 5 minutes later. "She talks too much. Watch your back." By the time Allison returned to the kitchen, phone in hand, her expression carefully neutral, I knew the damage was done. She sat down, her eyes darting to me. "You okay?" I asked, my tone light. "Fine," she muttered. But I could see it in her posture, the way she kept glancing at her phone, waiting for something. She was nervous. Brandon would be, too. I didn't go to work that day. I parked outside Brandon's gym, watching from a safe distance. Around noon, I saw him storm out of the building, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. His face was twisted in anger as he paced back and forth, shouting into the phone. I couldn't hear him, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he was saying. He was demanding answers. He was questioning Allison. The seeds were growing roots. And soon enough, they'd tear each other apart. By the end of the day, Allison was unraveling. She thought she was being subtle, but I could see the cracks in her mask. Her phone buzzed constantly, and every time she glanced at it, her face tightened, like whatever Brandon was sending her wasn't what she wanted to hear. I stayed out of her way, letting her stew. Watching her slowly fall apart was satisfying in a way I couldn't have imagined before all this. I didn't even need to confront her. I just gave her the silence she used to weaponize against me. That night, I went to bed early, leaving her alone in the living room. I waited for exactly an hour before creeping back down the stairs, careful to avoid the spots that creaked. She was on the phone with Brandon. "I don't know who sent it," she hissed, her voice sharp and hushed. "I told you, Mark doesn't suspect anything." I crouched low in the shadows of the hallway, close enough to hear every word. "You're overreacting," she continued, though her voice betrayed her own unease. "Nobody knows. How could they? Just, calm down, Brandon. You're going to make things worse." She paused, listening. "No, I didn't tell anyone about the policy. I didn't tell him. Why would I? I'm not stupid." Her tone cracked slightly on that last word, and I almost laughed. Not stupid? She had no idea how deep she was sinking. Whatever Brandon said next made her stand up abruptly, pacing back and forth. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll meet you tomorrow. But you need to pull yourself together before you blow this for both of us." She hung up and dropped her phone onto the coffee table, exhaling shakily as she sank back onto the couch. I watched her for a moment longer, her hands trembling as she rubbed her temples, before slipping back upstairs unnoticed. The next morning, I decided to push Brandon further. I sent another text from the burner phone, timed perfectly for when I knew he'd be at the gym. "She's meeting with him today. Ask yourself why." 10 minutes later, I parked across the street and watched Brandon leave the gym in a hurry, his face like thunder. I followed at a safe distance as he drove to the park just outside town. When I pulled into the lot, I saw Allison's car already there. She was waiting on a bench, her arms crossed tightly, eyes scanning the area. Brandon stormed toward her, his body language screaming anger. I stayed in my car, far enough that they wouldn't notice me but close enough to watch it all unfold. Why the hell are you texting me like this? Brandon barked the moment he reached her. What are you talking about? Allison shot back, rising to her feet. You're lying to me, he snarled, jabbing a finger in her face. Someone's watching us. Someone knows about the plan. And it sure as hell isn't me running my mouth. Allison's face paled. Are you serious? You think I don't think, Allison. I know how this works. One of us screws up, we both go down. Nobody screwed up, she shouted, her voice rising. You're the one acting paranoid, texting me at all hours, making everyone suspicious. Oh, this is my fault now? Brandon growled, stepping closer. You don't think it's weird that your husband's suddenly asking questions? Showing up at my gym? Don't tell me you haven't noticed him acting different. Allison hesitated, her shoulders stiff. He doesn't know anything. He's an idiot. Is he? Brandon shot back. Because you're starting to sound like Emily did. And you know how that ended. At that, Allison fell silent. The mention of Emily, whoever she was, hit her like a slap. I saw it in her face, the realization that Brandon wasn't just angry. He was dangerous. Her voice trembled when she spoke again. You're losing it. We just need to stick to the plan. For a long moment, Brandon didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression cold and unreadable. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there alone. When Allison came home that evening, her mask was flawless again, but I could see the cracks beneath it. Long day? I asked, watching her carefully. She smiled tightly. Just errands. I nodded, pretending not to notice the way her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag. I'm thinking of going to the gym again tomorrow, I said casually. Brandon's a good trainer. Her smile faltered for just a second, so quick I almost missed it. Oh. That's great. You should keep it up. I smiled back. Maybe you'll join me sometime. She laughed lightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe. As she walked upstairs, I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. The cracks were turning into fault lines, and soon, everything they'd built would come crashing down. Late that night, I sent Brandon one final text. She's going to betray you. She already has. It was a lie, of course. Allison hadn't betrayed him, yet. But trust is a fragile thing, especially between liars. I knew what Brandon was like. He was paranoid, possessive, dangerous. All it would take was a nudge in the right direction to turn him against her completely. And once he did, they'd destroy each other for me. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Allison's soft, steady breathing as she slept. She had no idea how close she was to losing everything. Soon. Very soon. Paranoia is like rot, it starts small, hidden beneath the surface, and before you know it, everything collapses. I'd planted the seeds, and now I was just watching them grow. Brandon was unraveling faster than I expected. The texts, the doubt, the gnawing suspicion that Allison might be playing him had done their work. But what I didn't anticipate was how quickly it would spiral into violence. It started the next day. I was pulling into the driveway after work when I noticed Allison's car wasn't there. She hadn't mentioned going out, but at this point, I wasn't surprised. I checked my phone, no text from her, and shrugged it off, playing the role of the unbothered husband. Inside, I poured myself a drink and sat down to wait. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, Allison burst through the front door, her face pale and streaked with sweat. She looked like she'd just escaped something, or someone. Where were you? I asked, keeping my voice even. She stared at me, chest heaving. Out. I raised an eyebrow. Out where? Does it matter? She snapped, brushing past me and heading straight for the kitchen. She opened the cabinet, pulling out a glass with trembling hands. Something had happened. I could see it written all over her. "Everything okay?" I pressed, taking a sip of my drink. She froze, her back to me. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she turned around, forcing a brittle smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Her voice was too light, too casual. It was a performance, one I'd seen her perfect over the years, but this time, the cracks were showing. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. "No reason. You just look a little shaken." She didn't reply. She drained her glass of water and disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with the silence. I waited until she was asleep that night before slipping her phone out of her bag. I'd gotten good at this, years of trust and routine had made her sloppy with her passwords. It took me less than a minute to unlock it. And what I found nearly made me laugh out loud. There were dozens of texts from Brandon, short, angry messages sent throughout the day. "Why were you talking to him? Don't lie to me, Allison. I swear to God, if you screw this up. Who's sending me those texts? Is it you? Just admit it." The last message was a single line. "I don't trust you anymore." I stared at the screen, a dark smile creeping across my face. Brandon was spiraling, and Allison was barely holding on. Perfect. The next day, the violence started. It was late afternoon when I got a call from Allison. Her voice was frantic, shaking. "Mark," she whispered. "Can you come pick me up?" "Where are you?" I asked, feigning concern. "The park. By the old train bridge. Please, just come." She hung up before I could ask anything else. By the time I got there, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the ground. Allison was sitting on a bench near the bridge, her arms wrapped around herself. When she saw my car, she stood up quickly and got in, slamming the door behind her. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. "Nothing," she muttered, staring straight ahead. I let the silence hang, letting her stew in it, before I spoke again. "You look like hell. Did you see Brandon?" Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. "Why would you ask that?" "Just a guess," I said with a shrug. "I know you've been spending time with him lately." She didn't answer, but the way her jaw clenched told me everything I needed to know. I drove us home in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. That night, I got the rest of the story from Carter. He called me out of the blue, his voice low and urgent. "It's happening, isn't it?" "What?" "The fighting," Carter said. "That's how it starts. Brandon's losing control." I frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "Brandon's done this before. When he thinks someone's turning on him, he lashes out. He hurts them, Mark. I've seen it." My stomach twisted, but I kept my voice steady. Allison didn't look hurt. Just shaken. "Yet," Carter replied. "Trust me, it's only going to get worse." Over the next few days, Allison grew quieter, jumpier. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched, and she'd lock herself in the bedroom to answer it. Sometimes, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her crying softly into her pillow. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then, on a rainy Thursday night, it all boiled over. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a drink, when I heard shouting outside. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just the wind carrying sounds from somewhere else. But then I heard his voice. "Brandon." I stood up and looked out the window. He was there, standing in the driveway, soaked from the rain and screaming at the house. "Allison," he bellowed. "Get out here." I heard footsteps upstairs, Allison running to the window. "What the hell is he doing?" she hissed. "You tell me," I said, my voice calm. She bolted downstairs, her face pale. "Stay here. I'll handle it." "Sure," I replied, watching as she grabbed a coat and stepped outside. I moved to the window and watched. Brandon was livid, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Allison tried to calm him, her hands moving as she spoke, but he wasn't listening. His voice rose over the sound of the rain, sharp and furious. "You lied to me," he shouted. "You've been screwing with me this whole time, haven't you? Stop it." Allison shot back, her voice frantic. "You're being insane." "Oh, I'm insane?" Brandon snapped, stepping closer. "You think I don't know? Someone's been feeding me lies. Someone's been watching us." Allison froze, and I knew in that moment she realized something. Brandon might not just be paranoid. He might be right. He grabbed her arm roughly, and she yanked away, her voice breaking. "Stop it, Brandon. Just leave me alone." He said something else I couldn't hear, then turned and stormed off into the rain, disappearing down the street. Allison stood there, shaking, her face contorted in shock and fear. She stayed outside for a long moment before finally coming back in. Her clothes were soaked, her hair clinging to her face. "What did he want?" I asked, my voice soft. She looked at me blankly, her face pale. "Nothing. He's losing it." I nodded, hiding the satisfaction burning in my chest. Yes, he was. And so was she. Brandon's outburst wasn't the climax, it was just the start of something darker. I knew the kind of man he was now. Brandon didn't just manipulate people, he broke them. And Allison, for all her cunning and lies, wasn't ready for the kind of chaos he could unleash. The following morning, the house was deathly silent. Allison sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in her hands, staring into space. She looked hollow, like someone who'd spent the entire night wrestling with something they couldn't control. I sat across from her, pretending not to notice. "You look tired." She flinched, blinking out of her daze. "Didn't sleep well. Something on your mind?" I asked, watching her carefully. Her grip on the mug tightened. "No. Nothing." She was a terrible liar when she was scared. I followed her that day. I didn't have to, but I wanted to see where she would go. She left around noon, glancing over her shoulder twice before pulling out of the driveway. A nervous habit, now. She drove straight to a small cafe near the outskirts of town and parked in the corner of the lot. Brandon was already there, waiting. I stayed in my car, parked far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to see them. Allison sat across from him, her hands gesturing wildly, her lips moving fast. Brandon, on the other hand, was stone still, his arms crossed, his face blank. And then, out of nowhere, he slammed his hand down on the table. The entire cafe seemed to freeze as heads turned, but Brandon didn't care. He leaned in close, his face inches from Allison's, his voice low and biting. Whatever he said made her shrink back into her seat. I smiled. He was losing control. And Allison knew it. When she came home that evening, she looked like a woman walking to her own funeral. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. She dropped her bag on the floor and sank onto the couch without a word. "Rough day?" I asked from the kitchen. She didn't answer. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down across from her. She didn't look up, just stared blankly at the floor. I let the silence stretch, waiting for her to break. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever feel like everything's slipping out of your control?" The question caught me off guard. Not because of what she said, but because of the way she said it, soft, distant, almost like she wasn't speaking to me at all. Sometimes, I replied, taking a sip of my beer. Why? Her eyes flicked toward me, and for just a moment, I saw it, fear. Real, desperate fear. No reason, she said quickly. Forget it. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. I was getting to her. And so was Brandon. The breaking point came 2 nights later. It was past midnight when I woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs, soft, hurried. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Then I heard the front door creak open. I climbed out of bed and moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. Allison was outside, pacing nervously at the end of the driveway. Moments later, headlights cut through the darkness as a car pulled up. Brandon. I watched as he got out, slamming the door behind him. He was furious, I could see it in the way he moved, his body tense, his hands balled into fists. Allison said something to him, her voice quiet and pleading, but he wasn't listening. He was shouting now, pointing toward the house, his voice carrying faintly on the wind. Do you think I'm stupid? I heard him yell. You're playing me, Allison. I know you are. I'm not, she shot back, her voice breaking. I don't know who's sending those messages. It's not me. Liar. Brandon snarled, grabbing her arm roughly. She yelped, trying to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. You're in on it, aren't you? You and your husband. You're both screwing me over. My chest tightened, my hands curling into fists as I watched him shake her. I wanted to go outside. I wanted to confront him, to rip him off of her. But I held back. If I stepped in now, the plan would crumble. This was their war, I just had to let it play out. Let me go, Brandon. Allison shouted, finally breaking free. You're insane. You need help. Brandon took a step toward her, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can walk away from me? You don't get to decide when this ends. He turned abruptly, storming back to his car. You'd better watch yourself, Allison, he spat before slamming the door and peeling out of the driveway. Allison stood there for a long time, shaking. Finally, she turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. When she came upstairs, I was already back in bed, pretending to sleep. She crept into the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid to wake me. I heard her sit on the edge of the bed, her breathing ragged and uneven. After a moment, she let out a choked sob, soft, almost inaudible. I lay there, my eyes closed, my expression calm. She was breaking. And soon, there'd be nothing left of her. The next morning, Allison didn't speak a word. She moved through the house like a ghost, her expression blank, her hands trembling. I watched her from across the table, my own mask perfectly in place. You okay? I asked finally, feigning concern. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something, admit something. Instead, she shook her head. I'm fine. You sure? I pressed. You look like you've seen a ghost. Her gaze lingered on mine, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something. Then, just as quickly, she shut her mouth and looked away. Brandon called me, I added casually, leaning back in my chair. He seemed upset. Her head snapped toward me, her face draining of color. What did he say? I smiled faintly. Nothing important. Her hands curled into fists beneath the table. I have to go out, she muttered, standing up abruptly. Where? Does it matter? I watched her leave, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. She was spiraling. Brandon was spiraling. And I was holding the strings. Allison didn't come home that night. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I sat in the dark silence of our house, nursing a drink as the hours dragged on. I didn't need to know where she was, I already had a pretty good idea. Brandon was the only place she could go now, the only person she thought might understand what was happening. That's how desperation works. When the walls close in, you cling to the very thing that's pulling you under. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen, sent from my burner phone. "You're running out of time." I smiled, the words echoing like a warning bell in Brandon's mind. I could picture him, sitting in his dark apartment, the walls closing in on him, every shadow a threat. He was unraveling faster than I'd hoped. Perfect. The next morning, Allison came home. I heard her keys fumbling in the lock, the door creaking open. She slipped inside quietly, probably hoping I wouldn't notice. But I was waiting. She froze when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of me. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched her. "Where were you?" I finally asked, my voice calm. She hesitated, her face pale and tired. "Out." "Out all night?" Her jaw tightened. "I don't need to explain myself to you." I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. "Of course not." She lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to say something else. When I didn't, she turned and went upstairs. I gave it 10 minutes before following. She was in the shower when I slipped into the bedroom, steam drifting under the bathroom door. Her phone was on the nightstand, locked, but it didn't matter, I'd installed a small tracking app on it days earlier. I opened my own phone and pulled up the data. Last night, she had been at Brandon's. But she'd also made 2 other stops, first to the bank, and then to an address I didn't recognize on the edge of town. I frowned, narrowing my eyes at the screen. What the hell was she doing? When Allison came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I was already downstairs, staring at the address on my phone. My instincts told me this was something new, something unexpected. I needed to know what it was. That afternoon, I drove to the address. It was a small, dilapidated house tucked away at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by overgrown trees. From the outside, it looked abandoned, windows boarded up, weeds choking the yard. I parked a few houses down and watched. No movement. No sign of life. For a moment, I wondered if Allison had just stopped here to throw me, or Brandon, off the trail. But then I noticed something strange, fresh tire tracks leading up the driveway. Someone had been here. I got out of the car and approached the house cautiously. The front door was locked, but when I pressed my ear against it, I could hear faint noises inside, movement. Someone was there. I knocked twice. "Hello?" The sound stopped. I knocked again, harder this time. "Anyone home?" A voice, low, hoarse, answered from inside. "Who's there?" I hesitated. "Name's Mark. I'm looking for answers about Brandon." The door creaked open a few inches, and a man's face appeared in the gap. He looked rough, mid-50s, gaunt and unshaven, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in months. His bloodshot eyes narrowed. "What do you want with him?" "I think my wife's in trouble," I said honestly. "And I think he's the reason why." The man stared at me for a long time, his lips twitching. Then, without a word, he opened the door wider and motioned for me to come in. The inside of the house was worse than I expected, cluttered, dark, and reeking of mildew. The man led me to the living room, where piles of newspapers and half-empty bottles littered the floor. He sat down in an old armchair, his gaze heavy. "Who are you?" I asked. "Name's Derek," he muttered. "And if you're dealing with Brandon, you're already screwed." I sat across from him, leaning forward. "You know him?" Derek let out a bitter laugh. "I knew him. Years ago. Before he ruined my life." I didn't say anything, letting him talk. People like Derek, people with nothing left, needed someone to listen. I had a wife, he continued, his voice shaking. We weren't perfect, but we were happy. Then she met Brandon. He convinced her of things. Told her she deserved more. I didn't see it until it was too late. What happened? I asked quietly. She took out a life insurance policy, Derek said, his eyes dark. Said it was for our future. I didn't think anything of it. Then one night, my brakes failed. Car spun out on the highway. I almost didn't make it. He leaned back, his face twisted with pain. She told me it was an accident. That I was imagining things. But I knew. I confronted her, and she finally admitted it. Brandon convinced her to kill me. Told her they'd run away together with the money. When she realized I'd survived, she panicked and left town. I never saw her again. My blood ran cold. Derek's story wasn't just familiar, it was the blueprint. Allison and Brandon were following the same plan. Derek fixed his bloodshot eyes on me. If your wife's mixed up with him, you need to get out. He'll make sure you don't survive. I shook my head slowly. I'm not running. Then you're a fool. Maybe, I said, standing up. But I'm not going to let him win. Derek watched me for a moment, something flickering in his gaze. He won't stop until someone stops him. I intend to. That night, Allison came home late again. She slipped into the house quietly, her shoulders slumped, her face drawn and pale. I was waiting in the living room. Busy day? She froze, her keys still in her hand. Yeah. Long day at work. Is that what Brandon told you to say? I asked softly. Her eyes snapped to mine, wide and fearful. What? I stood up, walking toward her slowly. He's unraveling, Allison. And you're next on his list. She backed away, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I said, stopping just a few feet from her. You think you can trust him? You think he'll save you when this all falls apart? Tears welled in her eyes, her mask slipping for the first time. Stop it, Mark. I shook my head, my voice calm and even. He's going to turn on you, Allison. And when he does, you'll realize you were never his partner. You were his pawn. She stared at me, shaking, tears spilling down her cheeks. Why are you doing this? I smiled faintly. Because I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. For days, I let Allison live in the growing wreckage of her choices. She was unraveling, bit by bit, jumping at shadows, barely speaking, staring off into space like a woman haunted by something she couldn't name. I didn't confront her again. I didn't need to. Brandon was doing the heavy lifting now. The text messages I sent to Brandon, carefully timed, perfectly worded, kept feeding the fire. Every lie I planted whispered poison into his ears, doubt about Allison, doubt about the plan, and most of all, doubt about his control. Control is everything to men like Brandon. Take it away, and they'll burn the world down just to feel powerful again. It was a cold, gray morning when the next fracture split wide open. I was sitting at my desk, pretending to work, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Your wife's at the hotel with him. Thought you should know. A jolt ran through me, but it wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. Brandon was panicking. I knew because I had sent a similar message to him the night before. She's meeting someone else. Watch her. It had worked faster than I'd hoped. Brandon's paranoia was no longer just a problem for Allison, it was becoming a weapon I could use against both of them. I sat back in my chair, staring at the message. I could have ignored it, pretended I didn't know. But that wouldn't be any fun. No, I wanted to see how this played out. The hotel was one of those cheap, roadside places you rent by the hour, far enough from town to be discreet, close enough for convenience. I parked across the street and waited, watching the entrance. Brandon's car was already there, parked crookedly near the lobby. He was inside. I knew Allison was too. I waited, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my pulse calm. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then I saw it, Brandon storming out of the hotel, his face red with rage, his movements sharp and violent. Allison followed seconds later, scrambling to catch up, still wearing the same clothes she'd left the house in that morning. She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but he spun on her so fast I thought for a moment he might hit her. I rolled down the window just enough to hear. "Are you kidding me?" Brandon shouted, his voice echoing across the empty lot. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" "Brandon, stop!" Allison cried, her voice frantic. "I'm not doing anything." "Liar," he spat, stepping closer. "You've been feeding him everything, haven't you? You and your husband. You think you can screw me over?" "No. I swear." Brandon grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her roughly. "You think I'm stupid? You think I won't bury you both?" Allison yanked free, stumbling backward, her voice breaking. "You're insane." Brandon pointed at her, his hand trembling. "If I go down, you're going down with me." He turned and stormed toward his car, slamming the door so hard the whole vehicle shook before peeling out of the lot in a blur of screeching tires. Allison was left standing there, disheveled and sobbing, her hands clutching at her face like she was trying to hold herself together. When Allison came home that night, she looked like a ghost. Her hair was tangled, her makeup smeared, her clothes wrinkled. She barely acknowledged me as she stumbled inside, collapsing onto the couch. "You look awful," I said softly, watching her from the kitchen. She didn't respond. I sat across from her, my voice calm and even. "Is it Brandon?" Her head snapped up, her bloodshot eyes wide. "What do you know about Brandon?" I leaned back in the chair, tilting my head as if I were confused. "You talk in your sleep sometimes, you know. Little things. Names. Secrets." Her breath caught in her throat. "You're lying." "Am I?" I said, smiling faintly. "You should be careful, Allison. You're not very good at keeping secrets." She shot up from the couch, her face contorted in panic. "Stop it. Stop playing games with me." "Games?" I asked, feigning innocence. "I'm not the one who started this." She stared at me, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, I saw the truth dawn on her. I knew. I'd always known. And there was nothing she could do to stop what was coming. She turned and fled upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I heard her sobbing, deep, ugly cries that echoed through the house like the sound of a woman drowning. I sat there in the dark, finishing my drink. She deserved every second of it. The next day, Brandon's paranoia exploded into something dangerous. I was coming out of the grocery store when I spotted his car parked across the lot. He was sitting behind the wheel, his hands gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't move. He just watched me. I didn't let it show, but I felt the anger radiating off him like heat. I walked to my car, loaded the groceries, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I saw Brandon's car pull out behind me, following. I drove slowly at first, testing him, waiting to see if he'd take the bait. He did. For the next 20 minutes, he stayed close, too close, his headlights flashing in my rearview mirror like a threat. When I finally turned onto the quiet road leading to our house, I stopped the car. I sat there, staring at him in the mirror as he pulled up behind me. For a long moment, we just sat, two men facing each other in silence. Then I got out of the car. Brandon stepped out too, slamming the door shut. He was breathing hard, his eyes wild. "What do you want, Brandon?" I asked, my voice calm. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I know what you're doing." "And what's that?" "You're trying to screw me over. You and Allison." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Sounds like you've got trust issues, Brandon." He took a step closer, his fists clenched. "Don't mess with me. You have no idea what I'm capable of." "And you have no idea what I know," I replied, staring him dead in the eye. "Think about that." Brandon froze, his confidence faltering just enough for me to see it. Doubt. Fear. He didn't know how much I knew, and that terrified him. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice low. "And stay away from my wife." I turned and got back into my car, leaving him standing there in the middle of the road, trembling with rage. As I pulled away, I glanced in the mirror one last time. Brandon stood there, alone, his mask finally slipping. He was scared. And scared men do stupid things. The next morning, Allison was still in bed when I left. She didn't even pretend to sleep anymore, just lay there, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. She hadn't been to work in days, hadn't eaten much either. Brandon's unraveling had become hers. That's how it works, isn't it? When you tie yourself to someone drowning, you get pulled under too. Around lunchtime, I got a text. From Brandon. It was a photo, blurry, zoomed in, of Allison sitting alone in her car. She was parked near the edge of town, her head in her hands, as if she'd been crying. "I thought you'd want to know what she's up to." I stared at the screen, a smirk tugging at the corner of my lips. Brandon's paranoia had finally snapped. He was following Allison now, desperate for proof that she was betraying him. Proof that she was the enemy. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. I knew exactly where this was heading. And it wouldn't end well for either of them. When I got home that evening, Allison was pacing the living room. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair tangled, her eyes bloodshot. She looked at me as I walked through the door, her expression frantic. "Mark," she said, her voice cracking. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." I stopped, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "Brandon," she whispered, glancing toward the window like he might appear any second. "He's lost it. He thinks I'm turning on him. He said he's going to what?" I asked, my tone calm. She hesitated, her lips trembling. "He said he'd kill me. He said he doesn't care anymore." I took a slow step closer, feigning concern. "Why would he say that, Allison? Unless you gave him a reason to doubt you." She flinched, her face contorting. "I didn't. He's insane, Mark. You have no idea what he's capable of." I tilted my head, watching her carefully. "And what about you? What are you capable of?" Her breathing hitched, tears spilling down her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I nodded slowly, my voice soft. "But it did." She stared at me, her chest heaving, waiting for me to say something more, for some sign of forgiveness or understanding. I gave her neither. Instead, I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her standing there, broken and shaking. Later that night, the phone rang. Allison was asleep, or pretending to be, when I picked it up. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I answered. "Hello?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Brandon's voice came through, low and ragged. "She's lying to you, Mark." I paused, my heart beating steadily. "Who is this?" "You know who this is," Brandon hissed. "She's playing you. Just like she played me. She's been feeding you everything, hasn't she? Making you think you're in control. I didn't answer. I let him talk. She thinks she's smart, but I see it now, he continued, his voice shaking. She's been screwing both of us over. She wants the money for herself. I almost laughed. He was so far gone he couldn't see the truth anymore. He didn't realize I was the one pulling the strings. What do you want, Brandon? I asked finally. He was quiet for a long time before answering. To end this. End what? You'll see soon enough, he said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Then the line went dead. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey, waiting for something to happen. I knew Brandon. I knew what kind of man he was now, desperate, violent, and unpredictable. He was backed into a corner, and when animals get cornered, they lash out. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it, a noise outside, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. I stood slowly, my pulse quickening, and moved to the window. Brandon was there, standing on the lawn, staring up at the house like a wolf watching its prey. He didn't move, didn't speak, he just stood there, his face shrouded in shadow. Then he raised his hand. He was holding something. A crowbar. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. He knew I was watching him. He wanted me to see him. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Allison woke up to find me already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I looked up at her, my expression blank. "Not much." She glanced toward the window nervously, as if expecting to see Brandon standing there again. "I need to go to the police," she said suddenly. "I have to tell them what he's doing." I raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly would you tell them, Allison? That your boyfriend is mad at you for trying to kill your husband?" Her face paled, and she sank into the chair across from me. "You don't understand, Mark. He's dangerous." I leaned forward, my voice low. "And so are you." Her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling on the table. "Please," she whispered. "You have to help me. We need to get away before he—" The sound of glass shattering cut her off. We both froze. It came from the living room, the unmistakable crash of a window breaking. Allison shot to her feet, her face white with terror. "He's here." I stood up calmly, listening for movement. The house was silent, but I knew better. Brandon was inside. I looked at Allison, her wide eyes locked on mine. "Stay here." "No," she choked out, grabbing my arm. "We have to get out." I pulled free, my voice sharp. "Stay here." I moved toward the living room, my steps slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, but my mind was calm. I'd been waiting for this, expecting it. I stepped into the room just in time to see a shadow disappear into the hallway leading toward the kitchen. Brandon was circling the house, looking for her. And Allison knew it. I turned back toward the dining room, where Allison stood frozen, her hands clutched to her chest. "Run," I said softly. She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted toward the back door, her footsteps echoing through the house. The shadow followed. And I let it. The moment Allison ran, the house turned into a battlefield. Her footsteps pounded down the hall, the back door slamming open as she bolted into the yard. I stayed where I was, motionless, watching the shadows move. Brandon wasn't far behind, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, a sharp contrast to Allison's frantic movements. I didn't call out. I didn't intervene. I just waited. From the kitchen, I heard him shout. "Allison." His voice was raw, furious. "You think you can run from me?" The sound of something shattering, a vase, maybe. Then silence. I crept closer, careful to stay out of sight. Through the kitchen window, I saw Allison sprinting across the yard, rain-soaked and desperate. Brandon followed a second later, stepping into the frame, his silhouette backlit by the storm outside. He looked feral, his shoulders hunched, his hand clutching the crowbar tightly as if it were an extension of himself. He wasn't chasing her because of love. He was chasing her because he needed someone to blame. And that someone was Allison. I followed them outside, keeping my distance, the rain slapping against my face as I moved across the lawn. Allison was headed for the tool shed at the edge of the property, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I could see it in the way she moved. She was exhausted, terrified, out of options. She reached the shed and wrenched the door open, disappearing inside. A moment later, Brandon followed, his crowbar gripped tightly in one hand. I stood still, hidden by the shadows, and waited. Inside the shed, I could hear their voices, low at first, then rising quickly into shouts. "You're insane!" Allison screamed. "This was your plan. You dragged me into this." "My plan?" Brandon roared back. "You're the one who screwed it all up. You were supposed to keep him clueless." "I did." Allison's voice cracked, the sound of tears behind it. "He doesn't know anything." Brandon's laughter was sharp and bitter. "Don't lie to me, Allison. Someone's been feeding me those messages. If it's not you, then who is it?" "I don't know," she sobbed. "I swear to God, I don't know." There was a pause, an awful, heavy silence, and then Brandon spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't believe you." A crash. The sound of something splintering against the walls of the shed. Allison screamed. I moved closer, just outside the door, watching through the gap as Brandon loomed over her, his face twisted with rage. He raised the crowbar, his voice trembling. "You thought you could play me? You thought you could walk away from this?" "Please," Allison choked out, her back pressed against the wall. "Please, Brandon, stop." For a second, I almost stepped in. Almost. But then Allison did something I hadn't expected. She lunged for the workbench, grabbing the first thing her hand found, a rusted hammer. Before Brandon could react, she swung it wildly, catching him in the side of the head with a sickening crack. Brandon stumbled backward, the crowbar slipping from his fingers as he crashed to the floor. Blood smeared the wall where he hit it, his groan of pain drowned out by the sound of the storm raging outside. Allison stood there, the hammer still clutched in her shaking hand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then Brandon's hand twitched. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, blood running down the side of his face, his eyes blazing with something feral. "You're dead," he rasped. Allison screamed and swung again, but Brandon caught her wrist mid-swing, wrenching the hammer from her grasp and tossing it aside. He shoved her backward, sending her sprawling to the floor. "Think you can kill me, Allison?" he snarled, looming over her. "You're nothing. You've always been." Click. The sound froze both of them in place. I stepped inside the shed, my presence finally known, a loaded revolver in my hand. I'd been saving it for this very moment, for when they were at their weakest. Brandon turned to face me, his face twisted with confusion. "What the hell?" "End of the road," I said calmly, raising the gun. "Mark," Allison gasped, crawling back against the wall. "Mark, please. You think I don't know?" I said, my voice low and steady. "The life insurance policy. The affair. The plans to kill me. You think I haven't been watching this entire time?" Brandon blinked, the realization dawning on his face like a slow-moving storm. "You son of a bitch," he growled, his voice hoarse. "You set this up." I tilted my head. "Did I?" Brandon lunged forward, his face a mask of rage. but I was ready. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the shed, the flash illuminating the chaos for a split second. Brandon's body crumpled to the ground, the crowbar falling from his grip with a dull clang. He lay still, blood pooling beneath him. Allison screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at Brandon's lifeless form. Then she looked at me, her eyes wide with horror. "Mark," she sobbed, shaking her head. You didn't have to." I turned to her slowly, the gun still in my hand. "Didn't I?" She stared at me, her body trembling. "Please. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want." "Didn't you?" I asked softly, taking a step toward her. "You wanted me dead, Allison. You wanted to take my life, my money, and run away with him. This is what you wanted." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head violently. "No. It was his idea. Brandon made me do it." I knelt down in front of her, close enough to see the fear in her eyes. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But you still chose to help him." She sobbed, her hands clutching at my shirt. "Mark, please. Please, I'll do anything. Just don't." I stood up, stepping back as she crawled toward me. "Goodbye, Allison." Her scream echoed through the night as I turned and walked out of the shed, leaving her there with Brandon's body. The rain pounded against me as I made my way back to the house, the gun still warm in my hand. I didn't look back. By the time the police arrived, I was exactly where I needed to be, calm, collected, and grieving. It was self-defense, I told them, my voice steady. He broke in. He attacked Allison. I had no choice. They believed me, of course. Why wouldn't they? I was the victim. Allison was taken away in handcuffs, screaming about how Brandon had set her up, how it wasn't her fault. But no one listened. The police had already found the life insurance documents, the messages, the lies. She'd buried herself long before I ever stepped in. The perfect crime isn't one you commit. It's one you orchestrate. And as the sun rose over the house I once shared with my wife, I poured myself a drink and sat in silence, finally alone. They destroyed each other, just as I knew they would. And I survived. The days after the shooting unfolded like clockwork. The police, the investigators, the reporters, everyone wanted answers, but they didn't ask the right questions. They saw a grieving husband and a violent lover, a woman caught between the two. Allison's guilt was easy to believe. Brandon's death made it all neat and tidy. Self-defense, they called it. The police didn't look too hard at the little inconsistencies, like why Allison and Brandon had been in my shed at all or how I just happened to be armed when I found them. They didn't question why the life insurance policy, worth a cool $1 million, had been tucked neatly into a pile of evidence that conveniently painted Allison as the architect of everything. And I didn't give them a reason to look deeper. I played my part perfectly. At the funeral, Allison's family barely looked at me. Her parents sat in the front pew, faces blank and empty, their daughter now, the woman who conspired to kill her husband. They couldn't face it. Couldn't face me. Brandon's funeral was private. Quiet. Fitting for a man whose life had been built on lies. I didn't attend, but I heard whispers that some woman showed up, someone from his past. Maybe one of the wives Derek had told me about. I made a mental note to find out who she was, but not yet. Loose ends could wait. For now, I had what I needed, my life, my freedom, and the satisfaction of knowing they were both gone. Or so I thought. 2 weeks after the funerals, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No name, no address. Just there, waiting for me. I picked it up, my gut tightening. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Printed on it were just 4 words, typed neatly and without flourish. "You're not done yet. I stared at the note, my blood turning to ice. I looked around the empty street, at the shadows cast by the setting sun, at the windows of my neighbors' houses, but there was nothing. No sign of who had left it. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. Who could it be? Allison was in jail, awaiting trial. Brandon was dead. Derek was out there somewhere, but he was a broken man. There shouldn't have been anyone left to care. And yet, someone did. The next day, I drove to Derek's place. He opened the door, his face haggard, looking worse than the last time I'd seen him. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, stepping aside to let me in. "Who else knew about Brandon?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Derek stared at me, confused. "What?" "I got a note," I said, holding it up. "It's not over. Someone's still watching." Derek's eyes narrowed as he took the paper, scanning the words. Slowly, he sank into the armchair, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's her," he said quietly. "Who?" "Emily." My blood ran cold. "You told me she disappeared." "She did," Derek replied. "But she's not gone. I've heard rumors, about her showing up in places Brandon used to be. About her keeping tabs on anyone tied to him. What does she want?" Derek shook his head slowly, staring at the note like it might bite him. "Revenge, probably. Same as you." The following nights were uneasy. Every creak of the house, every shadow at the corner of my vision set me on edge. I wasn't a paranoid man, but I knew better than to ignore warning signs. On the third night, I heard it. A soft tapping at the window. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. There, just outside the window, a figure stood in the darkness, hidden by the shadows but unmistakably there. Watching me. I grabbed the gun from the drawer and stormed to the front door, throwing it open. The yard was empty. Whoever it was had vanished into the night. But there, on the doorstep, was another envelope. I picked it up, my pulse pounding in my ears. Inside was a photo. It was of me, standing in the shed that night. The gun in my hand. Brandon's body at my feet. Allison crumpled in the corner, her face streaked with tears. Beneath the photo, scrawled in red ink, was one word. Confess. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the photo. My mind raced through possibilities. Emily. It had to be her. She'd been watching, waiting, and somehow, she'd captured the truth. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Allison was in jail. Brandon was gone. The police wouldn't listen to anything she said, there was no way she could prove it. But deep down, I knew the truth. If she had this, she had more. And she wasn't going to stop. The next day, I started seeing her everywhere. At the grocery store. Across the street when I pulled into the driveway. A flash of blonde hair in the crowd at a coffee shop. Every time I looked, she vanished. It was driving me insane. By the end of the week, another note arrived. Meet me. Midnight. Train bridge. I considered ignoring it. Burning it. Pretending it had never arrived. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't stop. Not until I faced her. So I went. The old train bridge was a place Allison used to go when she needed to think. She said the sound of the river below calmed her, helped her clear her mind. Now, as I stood there under the flickering light of the single lamppost, the river roared like a warning beneath me. I waited. And then I saw her. Emily. She stepped out of the shadows, her face half hidden by the hood of her coat. She was older now, worn, like Derek, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't gone out. "You've been busy," she said, her voice low and sharp. I kept my face neutral. What do you want? She smiled faintly, pulling a small flash drive from her pocket and holding it up. Everything. What's on that? Proof, she said. Of what you did. Of how you set them up. You're not innocent, Mark. You're just like Brandon. I stepped closer, my fists clenching. You don't know anything. I know enough, she replied, her smile fading. The question is, how far are you willing to go to keep this buried? We stood there in silence, the river roaring beneath us, the flash drive dangling from her fingertips like bait. I stared at her, my mind racing. And I realized something. Emily wasn't just here for revenge. She was here to destroy me. And I couldn't let that happen. The flash drive glinted in Emily's hand, tiny yet heavy with all the destruction it promised. The river roared below us, the icy wind biting at my face as we stood under the old train bridge, two people with nothing left to lose. I'm giving you a choice, Mark, Emily said softly. You can confess. Tell the police everything. Or. She let the unspoken threat hang in the air. Or, I thought bitterly, you'll burn me down yourself. You think you're doing the right thing, I said, my voice calm despite the storm inside me. But you're not. You're just opening old wounds. Emily's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. That's rich coming from you. You played them against each other like pieces on a board, and you call me the problem? I took a step closer, the space between us narrowing. They deserved what they got. And what about you? She snapped, her voice rising. What do you deserve, Mark? Her words cut deeper than I expected. For a second, the air between us seemed to hum, thick with tension. Then she held up the flash drive again, her eyes locked on mine. This is your last chance, she said. Confess, or I'll make sure the truth comes out. She thought she had me cornered. She thought she was in control. She was wrong. I moved fast, closing the distance between us before she could react. Her eyes widened as I grabbed her wrist, twisting it just enough to make her drop the flash drive. It hit the ground with a tiny clink, barely audible over the roar of the river. Let go of me, she screamed, struggling against my grip. Why are you doing this? I hissed, my face inches from hers. Brandon's dead. Allison's gone. It's over, Emily. It's not over, she spat back, her voice shaking with fury. You think you can bury the truth? You think you can just walk away from this? Her words were laced with something more than anger, something deeper. A pain that hadn't healed. This isn't about me, I realized, my voice low. This is about him. You still loved him, didn't you? Even after what he did. Emily froze, her body going still in my grip. For a moment, I saw the truth flicker across her face, the bitterness, the regret, the years of anger and loss she had buried under her obsession with revenge. Let go of me, she whispered, her voice trembling. I released her, watching as she stumbled back, her breaths coming in shaky gasps. This doesn't end with me, I said quietly. Brandon destroyed your life, and you let him keep destroying it long after he was gone. Emily stared at me, tears glistening in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might say something. Instead, she turned and ran. I let her go. The flash drive lay in the dirt where she'd dropped it, small and harmless now. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. She hadn't won. Not yet. But as I stood there under the bridge, staring at the flash drive that held the truth I'd worked so hard to bury, I felt something strange gnawing at me, a hollow emptiness in my chest. I'd won. So why didn't it feel like victory? I drove home in silence, the flash drive sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. I could destroy it. Toss it into the river and pretend none of this had ever happened. Allison would stay in prison, Brandon would remain the villain, and I'd go on living my life, free and clear. But the weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the blood, hung over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long time, staring at the house Allison and I had once shared. It was just a shell now, empty and lifeless. Like me. I took the flash drive and walked inside. The next morning, I made my decision. I drove to the police station, the flash drive clutched tightly in my hand. The officer at the front desk looked up as I approached, her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need to speak to someone," I said, my voice steady. "About the Brandon Mitchell case." It didn't take long for everything to come out. The flash drive contained more than just the photo. Emily had pieced together emails, recordings, and other damning evidence that painted a clear picture of what had really happened. The affair. The life insurance policy. The setup. And me. They arrested me a few hours later. The trial was short. The media called it the train bridge betrayal, a story of love, greed, and revenge that captured the public's imagination. Allison's lawyers argued that she'd been manipulated by Brandon and that I'd pushed her to the breaking point. My lawyers tried to spin it, claiming self-defense and desperation, but the evidence spoke for itself. In the end, I was convicted. Manslaughter, they called it. 5 years in prison. Fair enough. I saw Emily once after the trial, standing at the back of the courtroom as they led me out in handcuffs. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just watched me, her expression unreadable. Maybe she'd finally gotten the justice she wanted. Or maybe, like me, she realized there's no such thing. Prison is quiet. Empty. In a way, it suits me. I spend most days alone, replaying everything in my head, the choices I made, the people I destroyed, the man I became. Do I regret it? Sometimes. But most of the time, I just sit in the silence, listening to the echoes of what I did. Because that's the thing about revenge. You think it'll make you whole. You think it'll give you peace. But in the end, all it leaves you with is an empty room and a story that no one believes. Bye-bye.